This screencast is going to cover antibody-mediated immunity. I would recommend listening to the cell-mediated immunity screencast first, since that's the first one we went over in lecture, and I went over some things in more detail. Now, antibody-mediated immunity deals with fighting off bacteria. And remember, bacteria are different from viruses in one respect, in that they don't have to live in cells. They can free float. So here they are, they're small, they're sly, and they multiply. But also remember that macrophages and other types of white blood cells are going to engulf, through phagocytosis, these bacteria in order to try to get rid of them. And one of the things these macrophages or other white blood cells that use phagocytosis will do is they will put a piece of the bacteria on their MHC proteins. In this case, it's MHC2 proteins. So you've got them free floating and you have them engulfed in these white blood cells. What has to happen once they've been exposed and they're out there is we have to find the correctly fitting helper T. And remember, there are several hundred different helper T cells, each with different helper T cell receptor shapes. So the body has to find the one that fits. Also, the body has to find the right plasma B cell that has the right antibody that fits. And again, there are several hundred different plasma B cells, but there's only one that's going to fit this bacteria. Once we find the right helper T and we find the right plasma B, then they will co-stimulate each other through cytokines, and that will induce these plasma B cells to go through mitosis and to produce more plasma B cells and antibodies. And remember, antibodies are free floating. T cell receptors can only be stuck to a T cell. Antibodies can free float. So we get all these antibodies and all these plasma B cells that will then go after these bacteria and hopefully rid them from the body. What will also happen is we'll get memory B cells. These memory B cells kind of hang out in the bloodstream. And what happens is, again, if you're attacked by that same bacteria, you won't have to go through this process of finding the right helper T and the right plasma B. These cells will just go through mitosis, produce antibodies, and those antibodies will attack the bacteria before you even know that you have an infection. Now, one thing that happens, and this is the same for memory T cells, is that if the bacteria or the virus mutates slightly before you're infected by it again, so let's say you get an infection now, you get memory B cells, and then 6 years from now, you get attacked by the same bacteria, but it's slightly mutated, the memory B cells may not recognize that bacteria. Or a virus, the same thing, the memory T cells might not recognize them. And in that case, you would have to go through this step-by-step process again in order to fight that infection. Like with cell-mediated immunity, we also have regulatory T cells. Those, like in cell-mediated immunity, do the same thing. They stop the process, they control the process, so when the infection is gone, then the process stops. So the immune system there is some control over the immune system. Now, what can antibodies do? They can do several things. They can neutralize the pathogen by surrounding it. Agglutination, which we talked about with red blood cells, they can attack those cells and grab them. They can induce what's called a complement system, which if you're in 107, you don't need to worry about this. But basically what they do is they can enhance other immune system processes like phagocytosis and inflammation, or they can also lead to cell lysis, which is basically just killing those cells. So antibodies have many different mechanisms they can use to neutralize the bacteria. And again, if you're in 107, which is the one semester class, you don't need to focus much on this page. If you're in the 112 class, the ANP2 class, you do need to look at these different mechanisms in which antibodies can be used in order to neutralize a pathogen, specifically a bacteria. I've gone over this in class. I've given you these screencasts. If you have any questions, make sure that you're asking me, and we'll talk about how these relate to vaccines and so on in lecture.